The mahogany pan-led conference room at the World Economic Forum buzzed with the low murmur of diplomatic conversations. Outside, Swiss snow dusted the windows, while inside, power brokers from every continent gathered around Polish tables. The scent of expensive cologne mixed with fresh coffee as delegates shuffled through briefing papers. Camera crews positioned themselves strategically, their lenses catching the golden light, filtering through tall windows. This was where global decisions were made, where words carried the weight of nations. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation for what would become a defining moment. Donald Trump leaned back in his leather chair, his signature confidence radiating across the room. "You know, people keep talking about this young guy from Burkina Faso," he said, his voice carrying that familiar, dismissive tone. "Ibrahim something or other. They say he's smart, but come on." He gestured broadly, his gold cufflinks catching the light as several diplomats exchanged uncomfortable glances. These African leaders, they're not exactly known for their intellectual prowess. Are they? The comment hung in, the air like a toxic cloud, drawing sharp intakes of breath from nearby delegates. A French diplomat shifted, uncomfortably, while the German chancellor's aide frantically scribbled notes. "Sir, Captain Ibrahim Traoré has actually implemented remarkable economic reforms," ventured a State Department official, her voice barely above a whisper. Trump waved dismissively, his face set in that familiar smirk that had become his trademark. "Reforms, please, anyone can read from a teleprompter." The casual arrogance his tone made seasoned diplomats wheeze, knowing such words often preceded spectacular miscalculations. Social media was already beginning to buzz with leaked fragments of the conversation. What Trump didn't know was that Ibrahim Traoré was not just any young leader. At 34, he had revolutionized his nation's approach to sovereignty, combining military precision with economic brilliance that had economists worldwide taking notes. His speeches on African dignity had become required reading in political science courses from Harvard to Oxford. He spoke 6 languages fluently and had turned Burkina Faso's gold reserves into a symbol of independence from Western financial systems. The stage was being set for an encounter that would expose the dangerous folly of underestimating Africa's new generation of leaders. History was about to witness a masterclass in intellectual sovereignty. The tension in the conference room reached a breaking point when Senegal's President Macky Sall stood up slowly. His weathered face bore the expression of a man who had heard enough. Casual racism disguised as political commentary. "Mr. Trump," he said, his French accented English cutting through the diplomatic murmur like a blade. The room fell silent as phones were quietly pulled out to record what felt like a historic moment. "Perhaps you would be willing to test this theory of yours." Directly, his words carried the weight of centuries of African dignity, finally pushed too far. Trump's eyebrows shot up, his trademark smirk faltering for just a moment before returning with renewed intensity. "Are you suggesting?" "What I think you're suggesting," he asked, leaning forward in his chair with obvious relish. The British Foreign Secretary tried to intervene with a diplomatic cough, but Trump was already energized by the prospect. "Because if you're talking about some kind of intellectual showdown, I'm always ready." His voice grew louder, feeding off the attention as cameras began rolling more obviously. The Swiss moderator looked increasingly uncomfortable as the forum's carefully planned agenda crumbled. Within minutes, the challenge had taken on a life of its own as delegates whispered excitedly into their phones. Social media exploded with hashtags like Chew Intellectual Showdown and Chew Africa's Arrogance trending. Globally within the hour, CNN's breaking news alert flashed across screens. Worldwide, Trump accepts challenge for public debate with Burkina Faso's Ibrahim Traoré. The BBC's Africa correspondent was already booking flights to Davos. Sensing this could reshape international perceptions, Al Jazeera's political analysts were calling it a potential watershed moment for African leadership on the global stage. The format was simple yet devastating in its implications. A 30-minute moderated discussion on African sovereignty and Economic independence. No teleprompters, no prepared statements, just two minds meeting in intellectual combat before the world's media. Trump's confidence seemed unshakable as he adjusted his tie and smiled for cameras. But seasoned diplomats who knew Ibrahim Traoré's reputation exchanged knowing glances, understanding that arrogance was about to meet its match. The date was set for the following morning, and the world held its breath. In the quiet corridors of Ouagadougou's presidential palace, Ibrahim Traoré's academic credentials told a story Trump had never bothered to research. At just 34, he held advanced degrees in geology and military strategy, graduating top of his class from both Burkina Faso's military academy and France's prestigious École Militaire. His thesis on resource sovereignty had been translated into 12 languages and cited by economists at the World Bank. The young captain had memorized entire sections of Thomas Sankoura's speeches while mastering complex financial models that exposed Western exploitation. His personal library contained over 3,000 books on economics, philosophy, and African history, all annotated in his precise handwriting. Intelligence agencies across 3 continents had files documenting his remarkable analytical capabilities. His rise to power hadn't been through political connections, but through intellectual brilliance combined with unwavering moral courage. During military briefings, generals twice his age would defer to his strategic insights that consistently proved superior to conventional wisdom. He could calculate gold market fluctuations in his head while simultaneously analyzing geopolitical implications for the Sahel region. His speeches were delivered without notes, weaving together historical references, economic data, and philosophical insights in ways that left audiences mesmerized. International journalists had dubbed him Africa's philosopher soldier, a title he wore with quiet dignity. His photographic memory for economic statistics had embarrassed World Bank officials during their last visit to Burkina Faso. Word of the challenge had reached Ouagadougou within hours, and Ibrahim's response was characteristically measured and profound. Intellectual arrogance often reveals more about the speaker than their intended target, he told his communications director with a slight smile. His team knew that look. It was the same expression he wore before delivering devastating critiques of French neo-colonialism. He spent the evening not preparing talking points, but rereading Cheek-Ann Top's work on African civilizations. The irony wasn't lost on him that he would defend African intelligence while Trump remained ignorant of Africa's intellectual contributions. His calm confidence unnerved even his closest advisors who knew what was coming. Meanwhile, African universities buzzed with excitement as professors shared stories of Ibrahim's legendary intellect with their students. At the University of Ghana, economics students gathered around televisions, knowing they were about to witness their continent's dignity defended by one of its brightest minds. Social media across Africa erupted with pride and anticipation, with hashtags celebrating intellectual sovereignty trending from Lagos to Nairobi. The continent that had been dismissed was about to speak through its most articulate voice. History would remember this as the moment Africa's intellectual renaissance announced itself to the world. The stage was set for a reckoning disguised as a debate. The World Economic Forum's main auditorium had been hastily reconfigured for what media outlets were calling the debate of the decade. Adil technicians adjusted camera angles while sound engineers tested microphones that would carry voices to over 2 billion viewers. Worldwide, the iconic Davos backdrop gleamed under studio lights as delegates from 190 countries filled every available seat. Swiss security forces had quadrupled their presence as protesters gathered outside, some supporting Trump, others waving Burkina Faso flags in solidarity. The atmosphere crackled with tension as journalists from a laser BBC, CNN, and France 24 positioned themselves for the best shots. History was watching, and everyone could feel its weight. Trump arrived 40 minutes early, his usual media circus in full swing as he posed for photographs and made impromptu statements. This is going to be easy. He told Fox News, his confidence bordering on arrogance as he adjusted his signature red tie. His team had prepared him with basic talking points about African economies, most of them outdated stereotypes from briefing papers. He worked the crowd with his familiar showmanship, shaking hands and making promises about showing the world how real leadership thinks. The American delegation looked nervous despite their candidate's bravado, knowing that preparation had never been Trump's strong suit. Cable news networks were already running countdown clocks to the encounter. Ibrahim Traoré entered the building through a side entrance, avoiding the media frenzy with characteristic dignity and focus. He wore a simple black suit, no flashy accessories, carrying only a worn leather notebook filled with his grandfather's proverbs. African diplomats rose spontaneously as he passed, a gesture of respect that spoke volumes about his continental reputation. His security detail was minimal, just 2 Burkina Faso officers who looked more like university professors than bodyguards. The contrast with Trump's theatrical arrival was stark and intentional, representing substance over spectacle. European diplomats whispered admiringly about his composed demeanor under such intense global scrutiny. The moderator, BBC's seasoned diplomatic correspondent, reviewed her notes one final time as makeup artists applied final touches to both participants. Global stock markets had actually paused their trading to watch, with economists predicting the debate could influence African investment patterns. For decades, social media engagement had broken previous records, with Intellectual Showdown generating over 50 million posts across platforms in just 12 hours. The Swiss government had deployed additional translators as requests poured in from 40 different languages for real-time interpretation. In 30 minutes, the world would witness either Trump's vindication or his most spectacular intellectual humiliation. The clock was ticking toward a moment that would reshape global perceptions of African leadership forever. The moderator's voice cut through the electric silence as cameras zoomed in on both leaders seated across from each other. Mr. Trump, you question the intellectual capacity of African leadership, particularly President Traore. She began her BBC professionalism masking the historical weight of the moment. Trump leaned forward with that familiar predatory smile, his hands gesturing expansively as if he were addressing a campaign rally. Look, I built a business empire. I've been president of the United States. I know intelligence when I see it, he declared confidently. His voice carried across the auditorium with practiced authority, drawing nods from his supporters in the American delegation. The global audience watched as arrogance prepared to meet its reckoning. Trump's opening salvo was pure theatrical aggression designed to overwhelm rather than illuminate the complex realities of African governance. These so-called leaders inherit broken countries, and somehow that makes them geniuses, he continued, his tone dripping with condescension that made African diplomats shift uncomfortably. I mean, what has Burkina Faso contributed to the world economy? Really? His dismissive hand wave encompassed not just Ibrahim, but seemingly the entire continent, revealing ignorance that would soon prove catastrophic. The American media contingent looked increasingly uncomfortable as their former president's words echoed to the sophisticated international audience. European delegates exchanged worried glances, recognizing the dangerous territory Trump was entering with such casual racism. Ibrahim Traoré sat perfectly still during Trump's verbal assault, his dark eyes never leaving his opponent's face with an intensity that unnerved seasoned observers. His posture remained erect and dignified, hands folded calmly on the table as insults washed over him like water off granite. The contrast was striking. Trump's animated gestures and booming voice against Ibrahim's controlled stillness that suggested depths of knowledge waiting to be unleashed. African viewers around the world held their breath, recognizing quiet before an intellectual storm that would reshape global perceptions. His silence wasn't submission, but the calculated patience of a master strategist, preparing to strike with surgical precision. The moderator turned to Ibrahim, and the young president's slight smile suggested he had been waiting for exactly this moment his entire life. "President Traore, your response?" she asked, her voice carrying the weight of continental expectations and global anticipation. The auditorium fell into absolute silence as 2 billion viewers leaned forward, sensing that history was about to pivot on the words of Africa's young philosopher. "Soldier." Trump's confident smirk began to fade as he noticed a sudden shift in atmospheric pressure, though he couldn't yet comprehend why. The next 32 seconds would define not just this encounter, but the entire trajectory of how the world viewed African intellectual sovereignty. The countdown to Trump's humiliation had begun. Ibrahim Traoré's voice emerged like a calm river that would soon become a devastating flood. His French accented English precise and measured. "Mr. Trump, your question reveals more about American educational limitations than African realities." He began, his tone respectful, yet razor-sharp in its implications. The auditorium fell into absolute silence as his words carried the weight of centuries of dismissed African brilliance finally finding its voice. His dark eyes never wavered from Trump's face, which was already beginning to show the first flickers of uncertainty. "Since you asked about Burkina Faso's contributions, let me enlighten you with facts your briefing team apparently overlooked." The quiet confidence in his delivery made seasoned diplomats lean forward, sensing an intellectual masterclass about to unfold. Burkina Faso produces 60 tons of gold annually, yet under previous Western influence leadership, we saw none of that wealth. Ibrahim continued, his photographic memory unleashing precise statistics. "In 18 months, we've restructured our mining contracts, eliminated French corporate exploitation, and increased national revenue by 340%. His fingers moved slightly as he calculated figures that would take Trump's economists hours to verify, each number landing like a precision strike. "We built 3,000 kilometers of roads, established 500 new schools, and created a healthcare system that now serves 12 million citizens." Trump's confident smirk was rapidly dissolving as the complexity of Ibrahim's reforms became apparent. The American delegation frantically scribbled notes, realizing their candidate was catastrophically unprepared for this level of detailed governance discussion. But perhaps more importantly, Ibrahim's voice gained subtle intensity while maintaining perfect composure. "We've proven that African nations can achieve sovereignty without begging Western institutions for permission." His words cut through decades of neo-colonial assumptions like a surgeon's blade, exposing the intellectual poverty of Trump's worldview. "While you were building golf courses, we were building a nation that represents dignity over dependence, substance over spectacle." The audience could feel the ground shifting beneath conventional wisdom as Ibrahim dismantled stereotypes with surgical precision. African diplomats sat straighter, recognizing their continent's voice, finally speaking with the authority it had always deserved. European delegates exchanged glances, suddenly seeing their own assumptions crumbling in real time. Trump's face had transformed from confident arrogance to visible confusion as the mathematical precision of Ibrahim's governance record demolished his prepared talking points completely. "Well, the numbers, that's he," stammered, his legendary verbal aggression reduced to incoherent fragments for the first time in his political career. The global audience watched in real time as American exceptionalism collided with African excellence and shattered like glass against granite. Ibrahim's slight smile suggested this was merely the opening movement of an intellectual symphony that would crescendo in the coming seconds. The young president had just redefined what African leadership meant to the world, and Trump was finally beginning to understand his catastrophic error. The 32-second countdown to complete humiliation had officially begun. The global audience watched Trump's face cycle through expressions of confusion, realization, and dawning horror in real time. As Ibrahim's words sank in, his mouth opened and closed, like a fish gasping for air. The usual flood of confident assertions reduced to stunned silence. The man who had built his career on never backing down was experiencing something unprecedented. Intellectual checkmate delivered with surgical precision. His hands, normally gesturing expansively, gripped the edge of the table as if anchoring himself against a tsunami of humiliation. The Swiss moderator's stopwatch showed exactly 32 seconds since Ibrahim had begun speaking, marking the precise moment when arrogance met its match. Cable news networks would replay this expression of defeat for decades to come. Social media exploded instantaneously as millions of viewers witnessed Trump's legendary confidence crumble in real time across every platform imaginable. 32 seconds of truth began trending globally within minutes, accompanied by memes capturing Trump's bewildered expression juxtaposed against Ibrahim's calm authority. African Twitter celebrated with unprecedented unity, sharing clips of their young leader dismantling decades of Western condescension with mathematical precision and dignified power. European commentators frankly revised their talking points, realizing they had just witnessed a seismic shift in global power dynamics. American political analysts struggled to explain how their former president had been so thoroughly outmaneuvered by someone he had dismissed minutes earlier. The internet had found its new favorite moment of poetic justice. Trump's team behind the cameras looked like they were attending a funeral, their earlier confidence replaced by panic as they realized damage control would be impossible. His senior advisor frantically gestured for commercial breaks that wouldn't come in this live international broadcast format. The American delegation sat in mortified silence, watching their representative's reputation disintegrate before the world's most powerful audience. Swiss security noticed increased agitation in the American section as reality set in about the global implications. European allies exchanged worried glances, suddenly questioning decades of assumptions about American intellectual superiority over emerging African leadership. The political earthquake was just beginning. Ibrahim maintained his composed dignity, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough for Trump's humiliation to fully register with the global audience. His slight smile suggested this outcome had been inevitable from the moment arrogance decided to challenge preparation and wisdom. The young president had just redefined African leadership for 2 billion viewers, proving that intelligence recognizes no continental boundaries or racial stereotypes. Trump's 32 seconds of stunned silence would become a symbol of what happens when prejudice meets competence. The world had witnessed not just a debate, but a changing of the intellectual guard on the global stage. History would mark this moment as the day Africa's voice demanded and received the respect it had always deserved. Within minutes of Trump's stunned silence, newsrooms across 6 continents erupted into controlled chaos as editors scrambled to capture history in real time. CNN's breaking news banner flashed. Trump speechless as African leader delivers intellectual masterclass, while BBC World Service interrupted regular programming in 47 languages. Al Jazeera's Doha headquarters buzzed with excitement as analysts called it the moment Africa reclaimed its intellectual narrative on the world stage. French television networks struggled to explain how their former colonial territory's leader had just dismantled American arrogance with mathematical precision. Russian state media gleefully replayed Trump's bewildered expression, sensing an opportunity to highlight American decline. The global media apparatus had found its story of the decade. Social media metrics broke every existing record as the 32 seconds of truth generated over 100 million engagements. Within the first hour alone, African universities erupted in spontaneous celebrations from Cape Town to Cairo, with students chanting Ibrahim's name like a continental anthem of pride. Kenyan President William R. tweeted simply, "Africa has spoken," alongside a Burkina Faso flag emoji that was retweeted 2 million times. South African economists shared detailed breakdowns of Ibrahim's reforms, validating every statistic he had delivered with surgical precision. Nigerian Twitter created an endless stream of memes showing Trump's Confused face next to Ibrahim's calm authority. The continent had found its voice and the world was finally listening. European capitals buzzed with uncomfortable conversations as diplomats realized their assumptions about African intellectual capacity had been catastrophically wrong. The German Chancellor's office quietly began reviewing their Africa policy, while French President Macron's advisors frantically calculated the implications for their Sahel strategy. British think tanks started emergency sessions to reassess their analysis of emerging African leadership, recognizing they had been operating with dangerously outdated paradigms. Swiss bankers suddenly showed renewed interest in Burkina Faso's gold-backed economic model that Ibrahim had referenced. The intellectual earthquake was reshaping geopolitical calculations in real time across Western power centers. American political analysts struggled to process the implications as Trump's humiliation reverberated through domestic media cycles with devastating efficiency. Fox News awkwardly tried to spin the encounter, while their own commentators admitted they had never heard of Ibrahim's remarkable achievements. MSNBC ran continuous coverage analyzing how American foreign policy had so completely misunderstood African intellectual capabilities and potential. The Washington Post's editorial board called for a fundamental reassessment of our assumptions about global leadership in the 21st century. Republican strategists privately worried about the long-term damage to American credibility on the international stage. The world had witnessed America's intellectual arrogance meet its match, and the reverberations would reshape global dynamics for generations to come. Trump's recovery attempt began with his trademark deflection strategy, though his usual bombast fell hollow after Ibrahim's surgical dismantling of his arguments. Look, numbers can be manipulated. Everyone knows that, he said, his voice lacking its earlier confidence as sweat beaded on his forehead. His team frantically passed notes suggesting retreat. But Trump's ego wouldn't allow such obvious surrender before the global audience. What matters is real leadership experience. And I've run the world's greatest economy, he continued, though even his supporters cringe at the desperation. The damage was already done. But Trump couldn't stop himself from digging deeper into intellectual quicksand. His advisors looked like they were watching a slow-motion car crash they were powerless to prevent. Ibrahim's response was a masterclass in dignified victory, never gloating but allowing facts to speak with devastating clarity about American assumptions. Experience without wisdom is merely repeated failure, he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had transformed a nation in 18 months. Your great economy was built on exploitation of resources from countries like mine, where children died mining cobalt for your smartphones. The moral weight of his words settled over the auditorium like a heavy blanket, making uncomfortable truths impossible to ignore. His calm delivery made Trump's desperate deflections appear even more pathetic by comparison. European delegates nodded unconsciously, recognizing moral authority when they encountered it in its purest form. The moderator's attempts to give Trump another chance only highlighted how completely he had been outmaneuvered by superior preparation and intellect. The president raises questions about economic development models. She offered diplomatically, hoping to salvage some dignity for the American position. Trump seized on this lifeline with characteristic overconfidence, launching into a rambling monologue about American greatness that only emphasizes ignorance further. We've been successful for centuries while these countries, he began, then stopped as he realized he was about to make things even worse. His self-awareness arrived about 30 minutes too late to save his reputation on the global stage. Ibrahim's final statement was delivered with the quiet confidence of someone who had just redefined African dignity for the world to witness. Mr. Trump, your centuries of success came at the expense of our resources and our people's suffering, he said, each word precise and undeniable. Today, Africa chooses sovereignty over subservience, dignity over dependence, and wisdom over arrogance. The applause began slowly from the African delegation, then spread across the auditorium as even European. Diplomats recognized they had witnessed something historic. Trump sat in stunned silence, finally understanding that he had just been schooled by everything he thought he could dismiss. The intellectual colonization of Africa was officially over, announced by its most eloquent voice to an audience of billions. In the weeks following the encounter, African universities reported unprecedented enrollment increases in economics and political science programs. As young minds were inspired by Ibrahim's intellectual sovereignty, the University of Cape Town established the Traore Institute for African Economic Independence, while Mesa University in Uganda began offering courses on dignity-based leadership that reference the historic debate. Students across the continent shared clips of Ibrahim, dismantling stereotypes with the precision of a master surgeon treating. His words like sacred texts of liberation. Ethiopian scholars began translating his economic theories into Amharic, while Senegal's economists published detailed analyses of his gold-backed sovereignty model. The intellectual awakening Ibrahim had triggered was reshaping an entire generation's understanding of African potential and global positioning. His 30-second victory had become a continental, called intellectual arms. Western think tanks quietly began revising decades of Africa policy as Ibrahim's competence forced uncomfortable reckonings with their own ignorance and assumptions. The Brookings Institution published a landmark report titled Reassessing African Leadership in the Post-Traore Era, acknowledging systematic underestimation of continental intellectual capacity. French foreign policy experts scrambled to understand how their former colony had produced such sophisticated economic thinking while they weren't paying attention. British diplomatic schools added mandatory courses on contemporary African political philosophy using Ibrahim's reforms as primary case studies. The World Bank discreetly reached out to Burkina Faso, hoping to understand economic models they had previously dismissed as impossible. The intellectual earthquake had forced the global establishment to confront its own limitations and prejudices. Trump's political legacy suffered irreversible damage as the encounter became shorthand for American intellectual arrogance, meeting its inevitable comeuppance on the world stage. Republican strategists privately acknowledged that the former president had set back American soft power by decades with his casual racism and stunning ignorance. His 2028 presidential ambitions crumbled as donors realized his humiliation had made him a global laughingstock rather than a serious leader. Conservative media struggled to defend the indefensible, with even Fox News commentators admitting Trump had been outclassed by superior preparation and intellect. The man who had built his brand on never backing down had been reduced to stammering silence by a 34-year-old African leader. His political obituary would forever include those 32 seconds of stunned bewilderment. Ibrahim truly returned to Ouagadougou as more than just Burkina Faso's president. He had become the voice of African intellectual dignity on the global stage. International speaking requests flooded his office from Harvard, Oxford, and the Sayan, all eager to understand the mind that had redefined continental leadership. His economic policies became required reading in development studies programs worldwide, while his speeches on sovereignty inspired liberation movements across the global south. The young leader who had been dismissed as just another African politician had proven that intelligence, preparation, and moral authority could triumph over arrogance and prejudice. His legacy was secure as the man who reminded the world that Africa's time had finally come. The intellectual colonization was over, and a new chapter of global respect had begun. The moment when intellectual arrogance meets authentic leadership always ends. The same way with truth prevailing over prejudice. Ibrahim Traoré didn't just defend Africa's dignity. He redefined global respect through sheer brilliance. What did you think of those legendary 32 seconds? Subscribe and share your thoughts below.